In October of 2022, a motion-activated trail camera bolted to the trunk of a Douglas fir on a ridgeline above the Skagit River watershed registered a heat signature at 3:14 in the morning. The camera was one of several dozen units deployed across a wildlife monitoring corridor by biologists affiliated with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Its elevation was 4,600 feet. The terrain above it was broken talus and permanent snowpack. The terrain below it fell through old-growth hemlock and silver fir toward a river valley that most logging roads never reach and most boots never cross. The image the camera produced was not blank. The motion had triggered the sensor during light snowfall, in low-light conditions, and the animal moving through the frame was partially obscured by a hemlock branch crossing the foreground of the shot. What the frame showed was a large four-legged silhouette. A dark coat. A profile too broad across the shoulders and too heavy in the hindquarters to match the black bears routinely documented in that monitoring zone. A gait too deliberate and too slow for a cougar moving on a winter slope. The lead biologist on the survey flagged the image and forwarded it to a second specialist. That specialist could not make a definitive identification. A third analyst, a mammalogist at a university in the Pacific Northwest, reviewed the same frame and returned the same answer: unidentified. Not a corrupted file. Not a blown exposure from a sensor malfunction. An animal that experienced wildlife biologists reviewing a camera image from a monitored wilderness corridor in Washington state could not assign to a known species. The camera had been running at that location for 19 months. In that time, it had logged 112 identifiable wildlife events: mule deer crossing the ridgeline at dawn, mountain goat on the talus above the fir canopy, American marten moving through brush along a frozen creek bed, and twice a lone coyote traveling south across the upper snowpack. It had never, in 19 months, logged an event it could not name. The researchers entered the anomaly into the survey database, did not issue a public statement, and filed the image alongside several dozen other ambiguous triggers collected from similar cameras across the same mountain range over the previous 4 years. It would have meant nothing, except that it was not the only one. One unidentified image is an anomaly. Several dozen, accumulated over 4 years, distributed across a monitoring network spanning 5 counties and 2 major mountain drainages, begins to look like something else entirely. The cameras responsible for this accumulation are not hobbyist units mounted on deer trails in pursuit of trophy game. They are part of a coordinated large mammal surveillance effort that began expanding across the North Cascades in the late 2000s. When gray wolves started filtering back into Washington state from Idaho and British Columbia, and wildlife agencies needed to track the movement of a recovering predator ecosystem through one of the most roadless mountain ranges in the contiguous United States. As the wolf monitoring infrastructure widened, the camera deployment grew with it. Survey stations were established from the Methau Valley in the east to the Nooksack River drainage in the west, from the Highway 20 corridor in the south to the Canadian border in the north. Together, these units cover a rough survey corridor of 2 million acres of wilderness, which sounds comprehensive until you consider that 2 million acres of ridge, canyon, and old-growth canopy contains enough terrain to conceal almost any large mammal moving at night and at altitude. And across those cameras, across those years, biologists accumulated a category of image they could not easily file away. Not false positives from wind-moved vegetation, not blurred overexposures triggered by snowflakes crossing the sensor. Images of animals. Large animals. Animals whose size, gait, and coat color did not match the species expected in a given monitoring zone. A trigger in the Pasayten Wilderness, near a creek crossing used by wolves and deer alike, documented a large-bodied animal moving uphill across a subalpine meadow at dusk in September of 2020. The reviewing biologist noted in her field log that the posture and pace were inconsistent with any canid or ursid profile she would expect at that elevation in that drainage. A camera near the north end of Ross Lake, positioned on a slope above the Hozomene campground, captured what appeared to be a set of tracks in fresh powder in January of 2021. The tracks were photographed at close range. Their dimensions were measured. The stride length and the toe spread pattern were entered into a database and compared against reference measurements for every documented large mammal species known in the Pacific Northwest. The comparison did not produce a clean match. These images were not flagged as the product of equipment failure or human manipulation. They were reviewed by credentialed field biologists with combined decades of monitoring experience in the Pacific Northwest and entered into the survey record under the designation that scientific programs use when evidence is present, but identity is not, undetermined. 1 sighting is an anecdote. 7 is a pattern. Several dozen undetermined triggers across a 4-year window, spanning multiple drainages of a 2 million acre wilderness, is a question the survey record alone cannot answer. So what animal could be generating these images? There are 3 candidates that biologists in the region actually discuss when the conversation moves beyond what the official species list says should be in the North Cascades. Each presents its own version of the same problem. The evidence is more than nothing, and less than proof. The gray wolf is the easiest to address first, and the easiest to set aside for this particular question. By 2023, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife had documented at least 37 distinct packs operating across the state, with significant presence in the Cascades north of Highway 20. A lone wolf dispersing to a new elevation or crossing unfamiliar terrain at night is not unusual, and it is increasingly well documented. But wolves have a distinctive camera profile. The long legs, narrow chest, and high shoulder relative to body mass create a silhouette that reads clearly even at low resolution and in poor light. The biologists reviewing the ambiguous triggers in the North Cascades database are not misidentifying wolves. The images they cannot explain do not look like wolves. The wolverine is more interesting. Wolverines were photographically confirmed in Washington state in the early 2010s, when a researcher's remote camera in the North Cascades documented a specimen moving across icy high-elevation terrain in late winter. A sighting that confirmed what biologists had suspected for years, but lacked photographic evidence to assert. Since that confirmation, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has documented a small resident breeding population in the Cascades, distributed across high alpine terrain at elevations most casual monitoring does not reach. Wolverines are formidable for their mass, with large males reaching up to 55 pounds and body lengths approaching 3 feet, and their rolling, muscle-heavy gait at night can read as unusual on a camera frame. But wolverines produce a low, elongated silhouette very different from the shoulder-heavy profile of a large ursid. Several of the anomalous triggers in the North Cascades dataset show a body mass and shoulder height that exceed a wolverine's maximum documented dimensions by a substantial margin. Which leaves the third candidate, the one that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has officially recognized as having recovery territory in the North Cascades since 1993. The one that appears on official range and habitat maps for Washington state. The one whose current estimated population in the North Cascades, as assessed in the Environmental Impact Review, published by the USWs and the National Park Service in 2020, stands at somewhere between 0 and 7 individuals. Possibly fewer. Possibly none at all on the American side of the border. The grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis, officially present in the recovery designation, functionally absent in the field survey. The reason biologists take the grizzly question seriously in the North Cascades, even when official estimates suggest the American population may be functionally extinct, is geography. The North Cascades ecosystem does not stop at the 49th parallel. It continues north into British Columbia in a largely unbroken corridor of mountain and forest, and in that Canadian terrain, an estimated 50 to 80 grizzly bears occupy ranges in the Skagit and Similkameen drainages, in some cases within 50 miles of the international boundary. 50 to 80 bears in habitat that is contiguous with the Washington portion of the ecosystem, separated from the North Cascades recovery zone by a political line that a grizzly bear does not read and has no biological reason to respect. A grizzly in productive mountain habitat can maintain a home range that spans several hundred square miles. During dispersal events, young males have been documented traveling distances that challenge most people's intuition about how far a large carnivore actually moves. A male grizzly tracked via satellite collar by researchers from the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, Wildlife and Range was documented moving from his natal territory in the Skagit drainage of British Columbia southward into Washington state terrain before reversing and returning to Canada. The confirmed route reconstructed from collar data reviewed at the end of the tracking period covered more than 240 miles of mountain terrain, crossing river valleys, high passes, and old growth basins that contain no roads and no permanent human presence. That bear passed through Washington state. If a trail camera had been positioned on the correct ridge or at the right creek crossing, the image of that animal would have appeared in a Washington database as a large, dark-coated mammal at an unexpected elevation. It would have been filed, almost certainly, as undetermined. The monitoring gap between the American and Canadian survey networks across the border zone is not incidental. The terrain within roughly 40 miles of the boundary on the Washington side is among the least camera-dense wilderness in the entire Cascades corridor. Elevation increases sharply north of Ross Lake. Road access in the upper drainages drops to near zero for months each year. Battery performance on remote trail cameras shortens significantly in sub-freezing winter conditions, reducing effective uptime well below the nominal deployment period. And the drainages running south from the border, the upper Skagit tributaries and the high creek systems flowing through the Pasayten wilderness, produce some of the highest concentrations of ambiguous wildlife triggers in the entire 4-year dataset. The geography of the monitoring gap and the geography of the anomalous triggers overlap almost exactly. That is not conclusive. But it is not nothing. The argument against grizzly presence in the North Cascades typically runs along two lines. The first holds that the habitat is no longer sufficient to support a reproducing population. The second holds that an animal the size of a grizzly could not move through a surveyed landscape without generating confirmed photographic evidence. Both deserve direct examination before the question can be assessed honestly. On habitat, the North Cascades holds more than 2 million acres of designated wilderness, with additional national forest and parkland extending the protected footprint to roughly 5 million acres of largely roadless terrain. That landscape includes high alpine meadows laced with huckleberry fields, old-growth river valleys carrying wild salmon populations, and subalpine fir corridors that wildlife biologists consistently identify as components of core grizzly habitat. The Joint Ecological Assessment produced for the 2020 USFW's Environmental Impact Statement on North Cascades grizzly recovery concluded that the ecosystem represents the single most suitable unoccupied grizzly habitat remaining in the contiguous United States. Not marginally suitable. Not a compromise option. The most suitable, unoccupied ecosystem available, with a biological carrying capacity estimated at somewhere between 200 and 280 grizzly bears, sustained indefinitely, in the event that a source population were introduced or dispersed into the area from the north. That is ideal habitat, currently holding between 0 and 7 documented bears, bordered immediately to the north by 50 to 80 bears in contiguous Canadian terrain. On detection, the assumption that a grizzly could not persist unconfirmed in the North Cascades underestimates both the animal and the landscape. Research examining detection probability for solitary large carnivores in remote mountain camera trap surveys has consistently found that the odds of generating a clear, identifiable photograph of a single individual within a 12-month survey window are substantially lower than most people expect, in some documented cases falling below 15% for terrain with camera density similar to those deployed in the North Cascades monitoring corridor. Below 15%. That means a solitary grizzly moving through the existing monitoring network in any given year has a better than 5 in 6 chance of never producing a clean, attributable image. The animal could be there. The camera could miss it. Those two facts do not contradict each other. If you have stayed with this question to this point, subscribe to this channel. This is the work this channel does. Cases the official record has not closed. questions the field survey cannot yet answer, and the country between what is documented and what is unknown. This would not be the first time a large North American mammal persisted in wilderness terrain long past the point when its absence was treated as settled fact. The history of North American wildlife contains several cases that biologists now cite specifically when arguing that a species can be functionally invisible in roadless country for years or decades before confirmation arrives. The black-footed ferret was declared extinct by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in 1979. Not locally rare. Not seriously depleted. Extinct, as an official biological determination entered into the federal record. 2 years later, in September of 1981, a ranch dog on a property near the town of Meteets in northwestern Wyoming dragged a dead ferret to a farmhouse door. The animal was delivered to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Within weeks, a population had been located in a prairie dog colony complex spread across roughly 150 square miles of rangeland that wildlife surveys had examined and found empty. The species that was not there had been there the entire time. The survey had simply not found it. The story of the mountain lion east of the Mississippi follows a similar arc at a larger geographic scale. By the final decades of the 20th century, cougar populations east of the Rocky Mountain states were officially considered extirpated across the eastern United States, with the sole exception of the remnant Florida panther population in the southwestern corner of the state. In June of 2011, a male mountain lion was struck and killed by a vehicle on a highway near Milford, Connecticut. DNA analysis conducted on tissue samples confirmed that the animal had originated from the wild Black Hills population of South Dakota. Genetic material recovered from deer kills attributed to the same animal along its route established that it had traveled through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and New York. The total distance covered from its natal range in the Black Hills to the Connecticut highway where it died was estimated at approximately 1,800 miles. 1,800 miles of travel through populated eastern landscape, crossing state lines, moving through farmland and second-growth forest, and suburban corridors, confirmed by no one. A mountain lion the size of a large dog moved 1,800 miles through the most densely populated region of North America without generating a single photograph that any official agency confirmed before the animal was dead. The North Cascades is not suburban Connecticut. It is not Wisconsin farmland. It is mountain wilderness with river valleys that receive no documented human foot traffic for months at a stretch, with ridgelines where the nearest trail is 8 miles from the nearest camera. If a mountain lion can travel 1,800 miles through populated eastern states without a confirmed sighting, the question of whether a grizzly bear could move through 2 million acres of largely unmonitored Pacific Northwest wilderness without a clean photograph is a reasonable scientific question, not a rhetorical one. Honesty requires saying plainly what the skeptics get right. And what the skeptic gets right is that the evidence from the North Cascades camera dataset is ambiguous. No image from the monitoring network has been formally published with a species identification that contradicts the official record. No track cast from an ambiguous trigger site has been formally attributed to grizzly by a credentialed biologist working under a reviewed methodology. No hair sample collected in the North Cascades has returned a DNA profile inconsistent with documented populations. The ambiguous triggers are ambiguous. That is precisely what the word means, and it deserves to be said plainly. The answer to that honest assessment comes in 3 parts, and not one of them requires the animal to be absent. The first part is coverage. The North Cascades monitoring network, as extensive as it has become, covers its survey area with camera densities that, at peak deployment, average roughly 1 unit per several thousand acres of terrain. In high alpine environments, where battery life shortens in subfreezing temperatures, where lens surfaces ice over between maintenance visits that may be months apart, and where memory card capacity sets a hard ceiling on recording duration, effective uptime across the network runs substantially below the nominal deployment period. The survey as it currently operates is not comprehensive monitoring in any meaningful sense of that phrase. It is a set of samples taken from the edge of what camera infrastructure can practically achieve in a North Cascades winter. Dozens of cameras distributed across hundreds of thousands of acres of roadless mountain terrain is a beginning. It is not a census. The second part is classification. When an ambiguous image is logged as undetermined and entered into the database, it exits the active analysis pipeline. It does not generate a follow-up camera deployment in the zone where the anomaly was recorded. It does not prompt a targeted field survey of the area to look for corroborating physical sign. The institutional logic of a wildlife monitoring program is to document what is known and categorize what is unclear. In a region where grizzly bears are not officially expected to be present, an image that might be a grizzly moving at an unusual angle in poor light is classified as undetermined and filed. The circularity worth noting is this: an animal that cannot officially be present cannot generate official documentation of its presence, because the standard of evidence required for such documentation exceeds what the existing survey infrastructure is designed to produce for a species not expected to be there. The third part is preservation. In the wet, cold, high-elevation forests of the upper North Cascades, a large mammal that dies in remote terrain does not leave durable evidence for long. A grizzly bear that expires in the old-growth hemlock of the upper Skagit drainage, in terrain accessible only by days of off-trail travel on unmarked routes, decomposes within weeks, consumed by ravens working the carcass from above and smaller carnivores from below, the bones eventually scattered by wolverines and coyotes, and the slow chemistry of a soaking Pacific Northwest winter. The physical evidence disappears before any researcher could find it, in a landscape where no one is actively searching for grizzly remains, because grizzly remains are not expected to be there. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Not in terrain this vast, not with infrastructure this thin, not in conditions that move physical evidence from the landscape on a timescale measured in weeks. The trail camera on the Douglas Fir above the Skagit watershed is still running. A field crew accessed the site in the summer of 2023 on snowshoes to swap the memory card and replace the battery pack. The image from October 2022 is still in the database, still labeled undetermined, sitting in a folder alongside several dozen other triggers that 4 years of careful analysis have not resolved. The researchers who have reviewed that image have made no public claim. They have noted an anomaly in a monitoring record and continued their work. That is the appropriate scientific response to ambiguous data collected in a complex and demanding environment. It is also, if you are paying attention to the larger pattern of which that single image is one data point, an acknowledgement that something in the North Cascades is moving through terrain at 4,600 feet in an October snowfall at 3 in the morning, and leaving a camera record that experienced wildlife biologists cannot explain with reference to any officially documented population in that watershed. This is the space the entire question lives in. Not confirmed. Not dismissed. Filed in a database that no press release will ever describe. Maintained by researchers who are careful with their language because they understand what it costs professionally to be wrong about something like this. The Cascades have held that kind of question before. They held it through the years when wolverines were considered functionally absent from Washington, until a camera in Whatcom County proved otherwise. They held it through the years when the wolf was listed as extirpated from the state, until a pack established itself in the Cascades and began appearing on cameras across the monitoring network. Each time, the answer was the same. The animal had been there, and the instruments had not been good enough to find it. The camera on the Douglas Fir will trigger again. It triggers on most nights when the temperature drops, when deer move along the upper ridgeline above the hemlock canopy, when a marten crosses the snow below the old-growth fir, when the wind moves a branch across the sensor field at the wrong angle. And on some other night, at an hour when no one is watching in real time, something will move through the frame that the reviewing biologist cannot name. It will be logged in the database. It will be assigned a designation. And the North Cascades will keep the same information they have always kept, which is this: something is moving through this country that the current instruments have not confirmed. The question is not whether we will eventually find evidence. The question is whether, if we did, we would already know what to do with it.